iHeart, and on Odyssey. Now, from the Signature Bank Studios, this is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson. Only the biggest stories, only the biggest guests, and only the biggest opinions. This is AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. It's always fun when a newsreader interviews someone they don't know, they don't appreciate the perspective they're about to hear. They assume that when they do a segment like happened on this Turkish television station, climate in peril, a planet in peril because of climate change. And you've got the chyrons floating across the screen. El Niño's set to resume in late 2023, and ice levels in Antarctica at their lowest level in February, at their lowest levels in forever.
Yeah, you got to scare the people, and then you got to fill the news hole. You have a segment. You got to find somebody to solidify your argument.
Yeah, well, sometimes your producer apparently doesn't communicate or doesn't know what to communicate about the guest that's supposed to come on to reinforce the chyrons.
Oh, no, what happened?
Steve Milloy was the guest in this television program. You can find him at Junk Science. He was part of Trump's EPA transition team. We've had him on the show a number of times. And in response to the hand-wringing about end of days by this newsreader, Milloy took her first spin, so to speak.
So we see climate models suggesting a possible return around the world to El Niño weather conditions. What exactly does that mean? What will that look like?
Well, there's a very good chance that global temperatures will increase somewhat this year because of El Niño. Recent warming since the 1980s has been driven by El Niños. I don't think emissions play any role at all. Over the last 8 years, we've emitted 500 billion tons of emissions, worth 14% of man-made CO2, and there's been no warming. What causes the warming is the El Niño. As far as we can tell, there's nothing we can do about that. El Niño is a natural phenomenon caused either by volcanic activity under the Pacific Ocean, possibly with some solar contribution, but it's got nothing to do with emissions. So,
can I just stop you there, because that sounds so interesting, that you don't think what exactly has nothing to do with emissions, global warming, or what exactly?
Yeah, the warming. The emissions are not warming the planet. We've just had 8 years, of 500 billion tons of emissions with no warming. That's per, U.S. government data. So obviously, we are told that every emission warms the planet. That is clearly not the case. What we do know warms the planet are these El Niños, and we've had a series of them since the 1980s. The most recent one was in 2015, which is the last time we saw warming. Now, the next time we see warming could be this year, and it's going to be caused by an El Niño. It's got nothing to do with emissions.
Okay, so tell us.
Oh, boy.
I don't know how to respond because I don't really know anything on the topic. I just expected you to repeat those talking points you saw at the bottom of the screen there about how the planet is in peril. For more on where eco-supremacism has us at present, pleased to be joined by Patrick Moore, co-founder of GreenPeace, just for emphasis, yes. Author of Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom. Patrick Moore, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Great to be back on with you, Dan and Amy. It's been a while.
Yeah, it's good to have you back. So, what about the sort of the latest calamities that are going to befall us imminently? Obviously, the planet is going to end. I think we've got 6 or 7 years, according to AOC. But I mean, just even this year with declining ice presence in Antarctica and El Niños come the fall.
Well, let's start with the declining ice. The best thing that could happen for polar bears is if the ice declines somewhat, because that, in the summer, that is. In the winter, the Arctic is covered from ice from stem to stern. There isn't a square inch of it that's not covered in ice, even now when they're saying it's disappearing. But in the summer, you have sun 24/7 for 6 months shining down on the Arctic Ocean. This results in melting of ice during the summer, And if the ice melts enough to expose the surface of the sea, the sun can penetrate to grow plankton in the ocean, which is the basis of the food chain in the Arctic. There's very little growing on the islands up in the Arctic, but the ocean in the summer is rich in plankton, and this feeds the krill, which feed the fish, which feed the seals, which feed the polar bears. And so that's one of the reasons why the polar bear population has grown by triple or quadruple over the last years, since in 1973 a treaty was signed, which nobody ever tells anybody about. The treaty in 1973 among all polar nations to end the unrestricted hunting of polar bears. They were being overhunted. Wildlife biologists told the leaders of the polar countries this, and they all got together and made a very effective treaty. In some countries, like Norway, it's illegal to kill any polar bears. In others, there are very strict limitations, especially if they break into your house and are about to kill your children. But the fact of the matter is, the polar bears are fine, and a little bit less ice wouldn't hurt them one bit. As for El Nino, it's been going on since the beginning of time as far as we know. We don't know everything that happened 18,000 years ago. But El Nino has nothing to do with CO2. El Nino is a natural phenomenon cycling with La Nina, the girl child and the boy child. It's Spanish. And it happens because of upwelling in the ocean and downwelling in the ocean and currents in the ocean. And they are cyclical, and they're not totally predictable, but they are definitely cycles that go one after another. And they've been doing it ever since we started being able to measure things, which wasn't very long ago. So this whole thing about now emphasizing El Nino is ridiculous. It's got nothing to do with CO2 and all the sort of existential threat and the climate emergency and all that tripe. There is no climate emergency. There are weather emergencies, which have been happening since the beginning of time. There was a 200-year drought in the U.S. Southwest, which drove the Anasazi cliff-dwelling people out for good because they couldn't grow any food because there wasn't any water. And that happened 1,000 years ago. These things have been happening through history. That's why there are parables like the Great Flood in the Bible. There have been great floods forever. There's a great flood in California right now. They've just been complaining about drought, and then all of a sudden they're complaining about it's too wet. And that's just weather.
Well, speaking of California, I mean, they want to have all EVs by the year 2035, but there's a problem. Truck drivers aren't really on board with this.
Well, it's ridiculous you can make an electric vehicle that takes a few people in it. It's very difficult to make an electric truck that takes freight halfway across the country. You know, this is a complete pipe dream. This whole thing is being conjured up by people who have no understanding of what is physically and financially possible in this world. And by physically, I mean technically. The technical and financial aspects of this net zero pipe dream have not been put down on paper anywhere to any extent. And then, you know, you're going to have all wind and solar power, which means you're going to have electricity 1/3 of the time. That's about what they put out. 2/3 of the time they're not there. The sun, of course, is not there more than half the time because it gets dark at night, and then there's no solar energy. The wind does blow at night sometimes, but a lot of times it stops blowing in the day and the night for 2 weeks in a row. So then they say, oh, no, we're going to have lithium batteries. Well, when are you going to charge the batteries? When the wind and sun are working. So in other words, you're going to have 3 times as much capacity in wind and solar, which will cover up areas larger than many states in the United States to do that and break the bank at the same time.
I think.
What do you do with the batteries when they're dead? I mean, how do you dispose of them?
I think maybe going back to living in darkness would be fitting with respect to the policies in certain places like California.
Well, no, it's just the real problem is it's technically impossible, but in trying to do so, we could easily break the bank. And this could be basically the decline and end of Western civilization in many respects. Because Russia, India, and China And the people they are supporting in Africa and South Asia and South America, the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, they are helping people come up from poverty around the world. Whereas the United States and Europe and Australia, to a large extent, and Canada, are all going in the other direction. They're making it much more difficult. And now they've just given the World Bank president, or whatever his title is, to someone who is totally into this. In other words, refusing to have any fossil fuel assistance to developing countries, for example.
Well, maybe if we eliminate fossil fuels, the Anasazi cliff dwellers will come back to southwestern United States. Now, here,
I don't think ending fossil fuels is going to start rain coming down again. It's just also ridiculous. There's the upside down of this thing is so amazing because we are living in the Pleistocene ice age. They're all pretending that it's over, but it isn't. This is just an interglacial period called the Holocene. There's been 40 of them, punctuated by glacial advances during the last 2.6 million years, which is formally known as the Pleistocene Ice Age. They are pretending that this interglacial period, which is a garden variety glacial period compared to all the other 40 that happened, is something new. They're pretending that the Holocene has now ended the Pleistocene, which is a lie. Yet it's being adopted in high places at international conventions and all this stuff to fool people into thinking that this interglacial period marks the end of the Ice Age. There is absolutely no basis in saying that. There's nothing whatsoever to demonstrate that. This is just a normal interglacial, and in fact, it is cooler than the 3 interglacials that preceded it. The one before this was called the Eemian. There are names for the 2 others. I forget them right now. And then there's about 40 more that they haven't even bothered naming because why bother? There's 40 of them, and they're all sort of the same thing. And there's definite evidence of this from ocean sediments, cores of ocean sediments drilled down where they can use certain isotopes to determine what the temperature was over those 2.6 million years. Actually, it goes back 5 million years in the graph that I have, and it's a proven fact that that's what's going on, and yet they pretend that this is something special happening now when it isn't.
So with these mandates, the EV mandates, the elimination of the combustion engine by 2035 in California, the likes of that, the cross purposes that the environmental extremists are at the one hand, mandating EVs, on the other hand, opposition to mining for rare earth minerals, and the other examples that you provided too. And against the backdrop of what we experienced with COVID over the last 3 years, and a lot of supposition, theorizing that that could serve as, whether it was intentional or not, that could serve as a dry run for what these globalist places like the World Bank and the World Economic Forum and California, what they want to do to impose their will to make people comply with their beautiful lies, regardless of the consequences. I mean, do you get a sense of all that you've battled over the last couple of decades within the environmental movement, that there is resistance to where this could lead based on what we've seen over the last 3 years, or that that is in fact where this is going to go, absent a real sea change in the quotient of courage that exists among academics and experts in this area?
I'm afraid they're going to try and do it and break us all. There's no doubt that it is not possible, technically or financially, but they could try. Right now, they're planning to put 1,500 15-megawatt wind machines offshore the U.S. East Coast. It's staggering how much money this is going to cost. And whales are coming up on the beach dead in much larger numbers than they were before they started this project. And Greenpeace is on the side of the wind machines, on the side of a machine against the largest animals that have ever lived on the face of the earth. And you can see why I left them a long time ago. They have really now just turned into scum, as far as I'm concerned.
Wow.
That they would not take the whales over wind machines. We should be building nuclear reactors. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission has just approved a license for a medium-sized nuclear reactor. It's ready to go. And here you have Germany shutting its last 3 down. It had 15. Germany had 15 reactors. The United States still has over 90 nuclear reactors running 24/7, providing a good chunk of reliable and inexpensive energy in the United States. Those reactors last for 60 or 80 years. These wind and solar systems last for 20 at best. Then you have to rebuild the whole thing over again. And not only that, as I mentioned earlier, you have to build 3 times as much generating capacity because you have to charge the batteries while you are also supplying the entire civilization with the energy it needs that day. So it's so ridiculous that it must be a maddening of crowds. This is this is mass insanity that is taking place, that anybody with any knowledge of anything could think that this is a feasible thing to do.
He is Patrick Moore, co-founder of Greenpeace, author of Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom. Follow him on Twitter at EcoSenseNow. Patrick Moore, thanks as always. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Connect with Dan and Amy using the AM560 mobile app. Download it today at 560theanswer.com/mobile.
Balance of Nature's fruits and vegetables in a capsule, changing the world one life at a time.
Well, yes, I feel great. I have more energy, and I just went to the